Hi, welcome to Unapologetically You with myself, Tulse, and Kelly. We would like to introduce our next guest, who is the founder and performance director of the Athletic Tribe. This company is a bespoke coaching for human performance and supports executives, leaders, and athletes to reach both their peak and optimal performance. Our guest has an extensive coaching background, and throughout his 15-year career, he's worked with athletes and business executives in elite environments, including professional team sport athletes, individual athletes, and executives at multinational companies. Lee has worked with many athletes and teams within motorsport, golf, hockey, Welsh rugby, tennis, as well as working with the English Institute of Sport and football clubs across the UK. So please join me and welcome our brand new guest.
It's not like, a rally car where you could just hop in it and off you go, or you have to have a team of support staff, not only on the engine, but at the track. And that's kind of, it's not like you can play friendlies or you can put a rugby player or a football player into the reserves and go off and play a couple of reserves games that's going to be at a lower intensity to get the body back up and, or to give that player confidence.
So, Lee, thank you so much for taking time out to speak to Kelly and I on Unapologetically You. It's so great to have you here as a guest.
Thanks so much.
And it's basically, I was interested in your background with coaching, and you started with rugby, correct me if I'm wrong, before you worked in motorsport. How did you transition from coaching such a heavy contact sport to drivers whose toughest challenges would be to absorb G-forces around the track?
Yes, so I started with football was my first kind of exploration into professional sports. And the change from football into rugby was vastly different from a cultural point of view, and also from a strength and conditioning point of view. Then really what happened was my role into the motorsports world was with a junior driver. So that's where I really started off. And then kind of tasked to look at some of the research that's going around that sport. So my main first research project really for Hints of Performance or previously for them was looking at hydration in drivers, and looking at, obviously weight's a huge issue in Formula One. So how much of a dehydrated driver, and how much does that affect his cognitive ability? And there's nothing really been looked at from that point of view. And I think we're going to touch on this later. But it's real surprising that a sport that is heavily developed around data and is very much data driven in terms of the performance of the car, efficiency, economy, etc. And spending some time with you at the factories, you can see the level and intensity of effort that those guys go through, and it was quite mind-boggling and eye-opening to have a look at the levels of different people in that organization. And then to go there, and there's not much really on what happens to a driver physiologically during a race. There's no heart rate data. There's no kind of, we have ideas of rough G-forces, but from my understanding, I've stepped out of that world now, but that is slowly improving, and the technologies, speaking to Pete McKnight, Hinson, they're heavily involved in pushing the safety of and that's their big number one concern to a certain degree, is the safety of attaching electrodes to a driver, and if there was an accident, and how would that affect those types of things. So that's really where my base come from. But from our point of view, if we look at rugby as a contact sport, we know that neck strength is a key determinant factor of reducing the risk of concussions.
Yeah.
So there's a simple transfer. Now, obviously from a motorsports point of view, the G-forces are controlled to a certain degree. You know it's going to come at you in theory, unless you're blindsided. But very often, sorry, it's not very often that might happen. Whereas in rugby, obviously, the biggest risk for a concussion, and especially in my previous role with ice hockey, and they lose a lot of days due to concussion, is being blindsided, is not actually looking at where the hit is and reacting with that muscle strength to shore up your head, basically. So that's where the coaches are always reinforcing eyes up all the time. Whereas obviously in Formula One, especially with the junior driver, it was always they're coaching the same things, eyes up, as opposed to head down. So that's really where those kind of transfer things came into place. If that answers your question.
It does. Thank you. I didn't know about ice hockey in terms of, the surprising amount of hits that come unannounced, I guess, whereas drivers systematically know which turn and they anticipate the amount of G-force.
Yeah.
Unless they crash, obviously, that level of G-force and unexpectedness, that obviously they have sensors on the car as well, so they'll know that this is a major impact, and the medical team obviously intervene and things like that. But the amount of times that they have control with their neck strength and their physical well-being, rather than ice hockey where they don't really.
So if you look at the stats, rugby is probably the highest concussion risk and the highest incidence of concussion. And then quite shortly after that is ice hockey, because obviously not only do you have the ice, which is hard, but you have obviously it's surrounded by a rink. So it's quite easy for somebody to shove you in the back and you get pushed and your head goes against the board at quite a significant angle. Unfortunately, you get young ice hockey players. You're talking, under 20s or under 23s, and they've had 5 or 6 serious concussions, and it's time for them to say, and the doctors are saying, look, it's not a good idea for you to continue, because this is gonna, the next one could be a very, very serious injury. And with my experience in rugby, we've had some cases where it's not a 1 or 2 week return to playing. It's a much longer break away from not only the sport, but just life as itself. You've got to step away from screens. You can't do work. You need to be really trying to do as minimal cognitive loading on that brain to let anything. It's very much, to a degree, it's very much like a muscle strain. We understand now that we need to put a bit of load into the system to speed up the recovery, but it's with the brain, you need to, again, put a little bit of load in it and take it step by step by step. And especially for the under 20s, where they're having to go back to school and their schoolwork starting to suffer, that's a real where you're saying, hey, look, ice hockey is super important. And like any academy, very few of those under 20s will go on to become professional hockey players and have a good long career and be financially stable. But actually, your education is super, super important, and that's going to set you up for the rest of your life, basically.
Is this ice hockey in the UK or US?
Yeah. So I was based in Switzerland. So
Switzerland.
Ice hockey is the biggest sport in Switzerland from a spectator's point of view. Yeah.
I had no idea. Wow. And are they out of ice hockey after a concussion for the extended period of time because you think it's a worse concussion, or just that the fear of going back in is that it's highly likely it's going to happen again?
No, so we have the return from concussion protocols in terms of 48 hours after any symptoms, we move ourselves back, and in terms of the support network in Switzerland, the doctors are very well utilized. Our team has every player will have their own individual personal doctor to a certain degree because of the healthcare system. So, to have an injury, we you try to refer them to, it's like anything. Once you, as a physio, for example, in a rugby club, once you get to know a specialist or somebody who you trust, who you've worked with previously, you'd always try and encourage the players to go and see that specialist, because you built a relationship at back. And there's a couple of really good doctors that are specializing in that area and are super interested in it. So we would generally wait for them to come back and give feedback. Now, the problem that you have, and it's a huge problem you have with concussion, is that it's not a visible injury. Nobody's limping, it's not a shoulder issue. So, it's very interesting then to have conversations with coaches about, he needs a little bit more time, or she needs a little bit more time, because they're saying, look, they're walking around like normal, what's going on, and there was always kind of, and it's a discussion that you have time and time again. So one of my roles in the rugby club was kind of end stage rehab or return to play. So the physios would get them up to a certain level and say, hey, look, I think this guy just needs, some conditioning to get them back. Now, what's happened there is you've had a control over the system. The coach hasn't seen the player on the field. They've seen him in the gym maybe a little bit, but they've had no real kind of sight. Then they start to come out on the field and they see them running with me or doing some return to play drills, etc. And you're always then fighting that kind of snowball increase, because the coaches are like, oh look, yeah, they look good, and really, you get them 90% of the way there, and that last 10% is crucial for that successful return to play. And what we don't want them to return to play and be off the pace. We want them to go back with the best opportunity to go off and be as if they're not missing from the game. Now, that's very difficult, because as much as we think we can, and as much as we try to, create drills, practices that are like a game, nothing is like a game. So like, for example, with Formula One, nothing is like a Formula One race. And that was quite a surprise in my naivety to come to Formula One or not to Formula One, but to motorsports, and be like, oh, the drivers don't actually get that much time driving over the course of the year. A lot of it is done in simulators, which doesn't put the physiological stress onto it. You have your 4-day test battery, Barcelona, etc. And because it's not like, a rally car where you could just hop in it and off you go, or you have to have a team of support staff, not only on the engine, but at the track. And that's kind of, it's not like you can play friendlies, or you can put a rugby player or a football player into the reserves and go off and play a couple of reserves games that's going to be at a lower intensity to get the body back up, and or to give that player confidence. From a driving point of view, if you've had a bad crash and then, for example, you've had a couple of weeks off, or there's been a break in the season, you've got to come back in that car, fair play, you've got to then push it as hard as you can. You've got to get temperature in the brakes and tires so that you can go faster, but you've got to go fast enough to get the temperature in the brakes and the tires. So so it's like, wow, okay, it's a very interesting sport.
Yeah, I only recently learned that it takes 15 people to start the engine.
Yeah.
There's no key. It was
established that, didn't we?
That day, wasn't it, Cal?
It was a big surprise. Yeah. Who's got
so
the
it's
keys?
not like, it's just not like, let's put the rugby boots on and football boots on and get warmed up, and it's not. And a return to play is, you try to build it around the program, because what we try not to do is for somebody to be injured and then completely remove them away from the squad. We want to try to introduce them as much as, you want to try and keep them in that team framework as much as possible. So, the team are training on one pitch, and then the return to play players are training on the other pitch. Same time, they might even start to do the same warm up, and then you pull them across and you do your own things, etc. Or as it comes back to the return to play, you've put them into training, and then they would do a certain amount depending on what your metrics were in terms of distance or duration or number of reps, and then you'd pull them out basically. And you can't do that in motorsports. You can't say to the guy, hey, okay, we know you're not done well. Okay, next week we're going to do an hour's driving, etc., 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 or a number of certain laps. It just doesn't happen. And especially with COVID, it's kind of like, wow, what's going on really?
I think a lot of people who don't follow Formula One don't know that there is a regulation that they have to have a limited amount of testing, just to reduce the overall cost of the Formula One teams. And obviously with a cost cap coming in, I think now 2022, because there was COVID, they've delayed it for another year. This obviously is one of the biggest impacts that, it doesn't take one person to put a key in the driving seat and just go. It takes a lot of people to, go into formation so they can actually get that car on the track. But it's really, really interesting that you say about return to play for a driver, because that's really interesting to me, knowing that you can control the variables for an ice hockey player or for a rugby player or a footballer, but you cannot do that with a driver. But I wanted to ask Lee, what was the most challenging coaching drivers? Because you obviously raise a key point regarding the return to play and that being a challenge. But what is the most challenging that you've discovered working in the sport?
So in terms of my experience, and this is with junior drivers, or a junior driver in particular, is it. Again, the level of support that you have with that driver. So it's not just a sport. So even if you're in, Formula 3, or, even if you go down into the lower levels, there's still a hell of a lot of traveling. So I traveled to a couple of races, and there would still be between 15 and 20 people supporting two cars for a 17-year-old driver or 18-year-old driver. So that's a huge challenge, not to be with that driver all the time. That's why, obviously, with the Formula One guys, those coaches, travel the world with them, because they can get support to them all the time. And there's a lot that goes along with that in terms of how this, your travel might change, their commitments or their media, or and you need to be able to go with them. But from my point of view, is that young driver, realistically, are they going to make it? So we have to then say, right, well, we need time to not only focus on their driving, their physical capacity, their mental performance, etc., etc. We also need time to them to do their schoolwork, and them to make sure that they've got an education. Now, these young drivers are normally quite well resourced, but that's the biggest challenge, because when they're back at home, I could work with that individual, and pretty much control the physical development during the course of the week. But then they go off, okay, and then they go off to a race. So if I don't go with them, I'm informing. He had a driving coach, this one in particular, so I'm like, right, this is what I want him to do for a warm up. This is how he's going to do. Then obviously, how that gets translated, does it come off? Then, for example, they might travel on to the next race. So that week, without seeing him, I then have to give a program, and it's down then to the individual. The coach is a driving coach, and how they deliver that it might be in a different way to I deliver that, or it's an individual doing their own thing. So they have to be highly motivated. So they're the types of challenges from a junior driver point of view.
And did you find he was highly motivated to do the strength stuff? Did he see the value in it?
So I think this is a broader conversation. So, and it's a lot to do with, and I was thinking about this so if I go back last year in an ice hockey academy in under 20s and under 17s, and then I look back right to the start of my career, which was probably, I don't know, maybe 12 years earlier in a football academy, and how this has changed in that short span is dramatically different. Not only the attitudes, so creating that buy-in, which is a really interesting word for a coach, but creating that desire, that want, that need to keep improving, and to understand that, hey, look, strength development takes time, and it's a slow, consistent process. There's no easy, quick wins. There's no Instagram, social media, amazing exercise that's going to get you to where you want to be faster. If you haven't developed this big, broad base of foundational strength, foundational movements, an understanding of recovery, an understanding that how you need to warm up, all the things, how you need to eat as an athlete, and that's sometimes the difference. That in some respects, it's good that these players have access to see what their role models are doing, but in a huge negative, it's that ice hockey player who's been playing for 5-6 years in the NHL, that rugby player that's just won the World Cup, etc. They are doing very different exercises because they've built this whole foundation, and they're like, well, if he's doing that and that's where I want to get to, I need to be doing that. And you're like, no, you need to be doing this to then get to there, to then get to there, to then in theory get to there. And once you start to explain that to a teenager who's thinking, geez, I've got to do another 4 or 5 years of real big foundational work, some players take that on board and they love it, and other players, it's a real tough challenge, because they want to do specific exercises. They think that the exercises need to look like the sport to improve the sport. And then ice hockey, is a volume sport. So even my under 17s, they're playing between 54 and 60 games a season. That's not including some preseason stuff. So, and that's every Friday, every Sunday, or in some cases Wednesday, Friday, Sunday. So why would I'm trying then to be as general as possible, because I don't, they're getting so much specific work that, I'm actually having to kind of balance out all the issues that come with such a heavy time skating, so that was tough.
Yeah, the reason I actually asked that question about the junior athletes being committed to it is because I coach Australian Paralympics, and it's distance for me. I don't see them. They are actually motivated to do it themselves, or they're not. But I have actually hit the jackpot. And I think, I know we do monitor them, and so we get the results back whether they do or they don't do the workout, and what level they did it at, and how hard it was, and the wattage, and I get everything. But I just wondered if, like I said, I just hit the jackpot, or athletes these days, the junior ones, are a little bit more aware of what we do as coaches that can benefit the sport.
So I really think that Daniel Pink's work, about motivation in his book Drive is a real. When I read it, it kind of ticked a lot of boxes. Now that I look back at previous roles, so motivation is something called. Well, he bases it on 3 things: AMP, which is basically autonomy, mastery, and purpose. And I think back now to my rugby players that were hugely motivated, and you're like, they all kind of hit those boxes. And then you see players that weren't motivated, and you can see that one of those 3 strands is missing. So now with a young athlete, would I want to give them autonomy on their program? 100% no. How do I go about it? Well, you trick them. You either do this or you either do that. So they've now got, I'm making a decision about it. Yeah, you are, but you're still going to do the same work, basically.
Yeah. I
you
know,
know,
there's
and
ways, there's ways.
yeah, and you know, it's like with, you know, have a young daughter, you're either going to do this or you're going to do that, and
Yeah,
you get an action from them.
yeah.
You know, mastery, like being blatantly clear, you know, as a strength tracker is a great tool. You know, some people will turn around and say, well, it's not that valid, you know, predicted 1 RMs, etc., etc. But you can basically say, well, you know, 4 weeks ago you were doing X, and now you're doing this. You're improving. You're
Hmm.
mastering. And then purpose is a whole different, you know, world of. It's tough. It's tough.
Different
So,
for different people, right?
you know,
Yeah.
and if I look back to my under 20s, I'd say some of them you could see this is what they want to do. This is their purpose. You know, this is what they're driving for. So, you know, they're there early in, you know, they're there early to sessions. You don't have to do much. You have to do a lot for them, sorry, but they're always looking for extras. They're always asking questions. So that's the big thing, basically.
I find it really interesting that a lot of coaches end up building that relationship and creating that buy-in depending upon where their level of motivation is. So it's really nice to hear that you still use that stage process, and, you know, have they got the triad? Is it all fixed? And then which areas of development that you can expand on? So that's really interesting. But working between the physical aspects and getting them motivated, obviously it's a mental game too, but in terms of, you previously mentioned about training cognitive abilities with the drivers, and obviously mental health has a lot to do with driving, motivating, feeling passionate and adhering to programming. And obviously Aki Hintsa had created the Circle of Better Life and included mental health in that. But you ventured a little bit more into research and understanding a little bit more into that aspect. What made you, was it curiosity? What made you delve into that aspect, and what was the effects that you found upon driver training?
So from my role, so obviously I went to Hintsa, and I didn't have much from a driver's point of view to do. So what happened was they're like, look, we'd like you to come more into our corporate side. So if we look at kind of the Circle of Better Life, you know, in terms of all the 6 elements, mental energy is one of their stand-in kind of elements. And again, if I can create buying in now, not in terms of an athlete, but in terms of a client, you know, when you're working with top business leaders or CEOs or C-suite guys, they're really interested in cognitive performance. You know, their brain makes their money, not necessarily their body, but their body obviously has to be operating well for their mind to work well. So that kind of drew me into that realm more in terms of kind of the research. And probably it's an area that I was always interested in. When as most of us do, we start our strength and conditioning career, and, you know, we read Bomper, Berkochansky, you know, all these well-known authors, and you're like, but there's not much about coaching. There's not much about how to coach, basically. So what happened was I was working under somebody, and he said to me, have you read Stephen Covey's book about 7 factors of highly effective people? And I was just like, no. And he was like, just read it. And I read it, and I was just like, wow, okay. Yeah, a great book, an unbelievable book. And then you're like, right, what else is out there? So then, you know, you start to meet, you know, you like Daniel Goleman, working with emotional intelligence. Then you look at like Malcolm Gladwell's stuff, and all this took a whole different realm to me. But what you could do is that you could see things in that book that were actually happening from a day-to-day basis, and you could physically and verbally and auditory hear that happening in terms of the relationships that you were trying to create, or player relationship or coach relationship, you know. And to come back, that's where that kind of, right, okay, how can we go about improving somebody's cognitive performance? And if you think about it now, a driver, that's 90 minutes of pure concentration. It's very unique, I would say, in any sport, because in a Formula One race, you can't really relax. You can't really back off. You haven't got that brief time to take, like in football, in rugby, okay, there's a stop and play. You've got time to breathe. You've got time to say, right, what's going on here?
And there's a half time as well.
Yeah. And there's and then there's the opposite. You've got like golf, whereby it's impossible to be able to concentrate for 4.5, 5 hours. You need to have that ability to switch in, switch out, switch in, switch out. And that's huge, basically. And what we've got to do is that you understand that focus it's a skill, and it can be enhanced, and we can get better at it. And that is a question now, especially not just with young people, but with everybody. How many people these days can say, right, today I had an hour of concentrated, deep work where I wasn't interrupted. I didn't look at a text message or an email, or didn't go down a rabbit hole somewhere. It's very few. So from that point of view, with people's productivity and performance, you just need to try to get the smallest amount of time that possible. So, with one guy, it was like, right, 2 30-minute blocks out of the whole week, just for you not to answer emails, lock yourself in the office, tell your assistant that unless the building's burning down, don't come and speak to me, and just focus on their most important tasks, their strategy, whatever that might be, for example. And that fascinates it. It still fascinates me now, basically, that how we're looking to develop that cognitive performance. Because if you think about it, we're not very different to 20,000 years ago from a brain point of view, but technology, it's exponential. It's not doubling. It's what we can do. So for example, with COVID, look at the technologies that are going to have to be developed because of this. And next year, who knows what's going to happen. And it's quite scary to think in 10 years' time what the future lies, and will we be able to cope with that from a cognitive point of view?
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people can't cope now with it.
Yeah. And I really like the way that you mentioned distractions, and obviously COVID is a really good example, whereas a lot of people are relying on that piece of technology, whether it's for work or whether it's for social. But I was listening to an audio about thinking big, and even then it's reminding people how much you need to just stop and not absorb anything, like take time out. And this was relevant for business people more so than young people, but I think it's just as applicable to both generations, because having that space carved out for you where you have no distractions, where you're not listening to music, that you are just in a space to think, to be bored, to daydream, to focus on a problem if it needs be, and let your mind create the solution. And I feel like it's so imperative these days, but it's so underrated.
Yeah. And when we look at elite business leaders, I'd always come in and blah, 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 and there's a mixture. There's some would not be doing anything physically, and they're probably a little bit harder to work with than with people that are doing loads, because it's just trying to get them to do something. Mm-hmm. And then another business leaders are like, right, yeah, I'm training for an Ironman, or I'm doing a triathlon or whatever, and you are like, are you serious? You're already doing like 14 hours a day, and Saturdays, and probably a little bit on Sundays, and then you want to go and add on a good 12 16 hours of training on top of that. I'm like, you're nuts.
I agree, but some of them do.
But the reason why they do is just to get out their own head.
Yes,
it's just that we Totes knows I'm quite keen on the area of flow, and it's just that basically after 25 minutes on a bike or running, your prefrontal cortex slows down, creativity kicks in, you can start to daydream, and though you're still doing something, you're out. Normally you're outside, you're in nature, you can't get attacked on your phone by emails, by phone calls. It's just you on your own. And it's just like, yeah, it does make sense. But the caveat to that is that stress is stress. Physical stress is the same as mental stress. You're just putting more stress on the system.
Mm.
And you have to be careful, because what you need to realize is that I make a comparison between athletes. So my whole area, or my idea, is that my business people I work with are what we call cognitive athletes. So
Yes.
basically they're trying to improve their cognitive performance, but they're super competitive, and they feel that they feel as if they're not pushing themselves physically or mentally, they're not working, and come back to Tulsi's, yeah, it's like, it's okay not to do something. It's okay to just not do anything.
Yeah.
It's fine.
It's actually
Rest
important.
rest is not you being lazy. Rest
Mm.
rest is a requirement.
Yeah.
I try to speak to business guys about, how do you go around periodizing your week, your day, your 3-month cycle, or however you want to do. And they look at me like I'm a Looney Tune. And you're like, well, an athlete can't go out and Monday to Friday go high, 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 high. We have to put in days of recovery, to recuperate. And what people misconceive as peak performance is actually nowhere near their peak performance. It's like sleep. Once you start to reduce your sleep, your brain's very good at tricking you to say, hey, you're doing okay, your performance is okay. But when we look at the research, you're nowhere near it. And
Yeah.
that's back into like 2003 research. Now, what's it like now? 17 years on, basically. And well, COVID has helped, because COVID has increased the amount of sleep that people are getting. Looking at like the First Beat interview I did with the woman there, she's like, people get more sleep because they're not having to get up and they're not having to travel into work.
Yeah.
And so I think this data is like early 1900s, average about 9 hours a night. Now we're looking at like 6 hours and 15, 6 hours and 6.5 hours. So that's 2 cycles, gone.
Mm-hmm.
And those cycles are heavily weighted to light sleep, which is basically mental performance, memory consolidation, executive functioning, which is where the money is, not from a working point of view. So it's pretty interesting times.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know how well I'd function on 6 hours sleep a night. To be honest, I've never been able to really consistently do 6 hours. So.
And yeah, and those business people are genetically like freaks. They're like your great athletes. They're genetic freaks. They seem to be able to do it. But if I said to an athlete, you can only sleep 6 hours every night, I'm sure they'd all turn around and say, you're an idiot. What you doing?
Yeah.
Why? And I say that to a leader or someone or a CEO, and they're like, yeah, but I've got to. I need to work. And we as coaches need to be careful. And this is one of my big pet hates with social media, is people use this term grind and hustle in pretty much every freaking post they put out there. Training should not be a grind. Training, yeah, okay, there might
should be
times
stimulating.
There might be times of it being not nice and
Yeah.
applying
Once a week, maybe.
And applying the struggle. But if it's a grind, are you really improving? No, I'd say 100% not. We all understand that, performance is like a glass of water. You perform, you take some out, you need to recover to put it back in. Otherwise, if you just keep taking and taking and taking,
then you're always mediocre, aren't you?
Yeah. And this is a huge problem, where if we go back full circle to working with young athletes, they believe that they need to be some of them, right, I need to be grinding every day because,
Yeah.
you know, that's what Cristiano Ronaldo does. That's what they put on their posts. That's what
I
these
know.
coaches,
Yeah.
you know, that's what the guy on Instagram who's shredded, great athlete does. And you're like, yeah, do they really?
Yeah. I
Or is
know.
that a, you know, a snapshot, no context put to it, you know? And that's
Absolutely.
where, if you go into performance environments as a coach to, you know, so I've been lucky enough that some of my colleagues have gone on to do great things, and, you know, I've been able to go in and visit their environments, and you walk out of there and you're like, well, that was pretty poor, wasn't it? I didn't really think that. I thought I'd get more from it, or I think I'd see something amazing or whatever.
I know.
And then you travel, and then you're like, hey, well, put some context on it. You know, that's one shot. That might not even be a whole day. That might just be a session. You know, you need to have a whole amount of context before that. You know, where are they in their cycle? What's previously happened in the 2 weeks? What's the relationship between the players, like the coaches? You know, and that's where internships are really good, because it puts you in that environment, hopefully for a whole year, and you can see that realistically a year is still a short snapshot of somebody's physical development, but it's an opportunity to see things about. We could have a whole biggest conversation about internships and, you know, the
No,
way
it's
they're
another
going.
podcast.
It's scary.
Well, it's funny that you spoke about sleep, because one of my questions actually is, you are a father, and you aren't willing, correct me if I'm wrong, aren't willing to compromise family time for your job. I know some coaches have created a limit regarding the total hours that they are away from their family, and have actually not taken up work because of that, which is admirable, because a lot of times, as you just said, you know, it's all about the grind, it's all about the hard work and the hours that you put in. For them to say no to a role because they know it's going to impact their family and that area of life, how have you created that boundary for you and your family, and what led you to this compromise? Because I feel like it needs to be outspoken that people do take that into consideration, and that's okay, because it's not always seen on social media that that's okay.
So if I put back to, so last year, obviously being in an academy, so normally training every evening, or every late afternoon, evening, plus on top Saturdays and Sundays. Now, where I was based in, my daughter's 3, so in France, kids go to school full time at the age of 3. So that would mean that I would see her, you know, from 7 a.m. to probably 8:30 every day, and then maybe a little bit in Saturday afternoons, sometime on Sunday. And that didn't sit well with me. And it's very difficult to be in an office of coaches where they're younger than me, no girlfriends. They're all male, sorry, no girlfriends, no children, no real dependents, and would be quite happily to, you know, to go into the office early to sit down and watch a game of hockey so they could talk about, etc. And, you know, it's not an unspoken rule, but sometimes it's quite, you know, that, hey, why are you not in the office, or you should be in the office, or and that was like, no, I'm here to do my job, and I can do my job my best ability doing these hours. And what kind of brought this about was, in terms of coaching a couple of business people, and I traveled to Asia and I did some workshops, and the big boss come in, and I did some you know, some workshops and presentations, and he said to his group of individuals, and this is, bear in mind, this is a senior leader, this is, and being in this culture, it was like the senior leader stands up, everyone else stands up, he sits down, you can sit down. And he basically broke down a little bit, because he spoke to his eldest daughter, and, you know, he said, look, you know, what do you want? And she's like, all I wanted was, when I was 12, to spend more time with you, Dad. And basically you're like, wow, okay. And that's not what I want, basically. And, you know, and yeah, strength and conditioning, it's not a career, it's a life. You've got to be in it. You've got to be not only coaching, you need to be reading, you need to be networking, you need to be watching the latest thing. It's a full-time gig. It is, and something has to give. And I made a decision that that was not what I wanted to do, and I believe that I can enable enough people for me to feel my purpose, to improve their performance in business, in sports, in whatever they want to do, by not sacrificing that. And it's tough. It is real tough.
It
But
is.
I know loads of other coaches that are doing it.
That's good to hear. I've been, probably most of my career, I've been the only one who's a parent in the coaching group, and definitely the playing group. And it's hard to get that message across, isn't it? That you actually don't want to go out, or you don't want to work on the weekends, or you don't want to travel away for 8 weeks because you will miss your baby girl. Yeah. So I'm glad to hear that, and I'm glad to hear that you're enabling other people to feel like it's okay to say that.
Yeah, it's tough. You think back now, and it comes full circle. Well, not full circle, but back to internships. The amount of hours that you put into an internship, and it's quite scary. That your life is at a football club or at a rugby club, and then something significant comes along in your life, and you want to be able, going back to kind of some of the core values, that everybody has numerous identities. And this is the biggest problem I see with both top level athletes and also business people at the moment. And there's this whole mental health area about professional athletes. Why do they have such difficulty once they retire? Well, it's easy. I was a professional athlete. That's my identity. My whole social media was driven by that. I knew my training times. I had a network of friends. I had a purpose to do something, and that's come along and somebody's taken that away from me. Or I'm a CEO of this business. I lead people. I create positive. I get the sack, or I lose my job. My whole identity goes away. And the problem is, then you're in a situation where, because you've invested so much time into that one thing, that you then, your relationship with your spouse, your friends, your children, what you are outside of that is null and void. And you've got nowhere to kind of turn to for support. If you think of them as pillars, and the work and your career is this huge wide pillar, and then the other ones are kind of like these little sticks, and then you turn for support, and they crumble and they break. So you need to have, and everyone does have different identities. I'm a coach, I'm a husband, I'm a dad, I'm a son, I'm an athlete of types, or however you want to do it. And in between them always is the reasons why you do it. And you probably look back and there's multiple reasons in each block that all kind of link together. And that's where you're trying to encourage people to do things that tick all those identities. So, one guy I worked with loved mountain biking, loved being in nature, loved being with his family and wife. Well, going for a mountain bike ride on a weekend for 30 minutes to an hour, or however long he wanted to go, ticked all those identities, ticked all those boxes, and just was a big win, basically. And that's it from my point of view, of why I made that decision, is because I look back now and I think, you are just a hockey coach, you are just a strength and conditioning coach, that. And people need to be careful. If I say to Tols, "Hi, Tols," no, or if I say, "Who are you?" She goes, "Blah blah blah. I am a strength and conditioning coach."
Yes, yeah.
It's tough. It's a tough one.
Is. My grandma taught me something a long time ago. When I was at uni, as a part-time job, I did modeling, and people would say she's a model. But my nana used to always say to me, tell, or at least say to yourself, I do modeling. I do this, yeah, rather than I am a. And that has always stuck with me very much. And so everything I do now, I do coaching. I work with, yeah, not yeah. So very, very important not to define yourself by your role or the kit you wear and the name on your shirt, isn't it?
Very
I've
hard.
had, yeah, lots of friends who've lost their positions with COVID and in the years before that, and it has been life changing in a very dramatic way for them,
Yeah.
and not necessarily easy to cope with, right?
No,
Yeah,
100%.
yeah,
And that's where doing this type of work, you know, in terms of thinking about identities, is so much easier to do it from a place of kind of control or normality than now, where everything's gone, you know, and you're up against it, and stress is a real factor of that.
mm-hmm.
And it's hugely important. I don't think enough young coaches really truly do that. You know, they think it's just, you know, there's a career path. You know, the UKCA or whoever sits down and say, this is what you need to do. I need to do my undergrad. I need to do my master's. I then need to go and do 2 years of, you know, a year or 2 years internship. Then I get a junior position. Then I get and eventually one day I'll become head of performance. That's it. And we know that nothing in sport, no books, progression is not linear. But
No.
we lay out these models as if it's like, right, but step, and it doesn't happen like that, you know. And a backward step is not necessarily a bad thing, you know, because a backward step might mean two jumps ahead. You know, I see it a lot of the time is that people write down head of strength and conditioning, but they're the only person in the department, and I'm like, what are you head of? Who's under your control, you know? Or head of performance? Well, really, you know? So people answer to you, and you're just like, look, don't, just take your time, you know, just you know, be patient. Like, don't, you know, one of my people I know, he's a young lad, he's put on Twitter, the strength guru, and I'm like, mate, you're 21 years old, you know. What are you a group? What, realistically, you're not a guru of strength. What are you a guru of, to be fair? And that's where, you know, and Stephen Cutler in lots of his books puts it, you know, you can't be a life coach, you know, if you're 25 years old and try to go around. It's you know, with people's respect and stuff like that. I'm not bashing anybody, but it's just like, you're gonna come across challenges. And strength and conditioning, as much as we want to say it, you have to know your stuff. You have to have done this. But if you're trying to get a job, your experience is hugely important, because it just brings a trust factor from a technical coach. If I know that my S&C has done 10 years experience at this level, or 5 years experience, it allows them to have that trust in what you're doing with their players.
Absolutely. I would always also add into that there are times when I've worked in rehabilitation studios, helping people learn to walk again and things like that. And I always thought that my work with athletes would help me work with general public people. 100% the reverse.
Yeah.
Things I've learned working with general public have helped me exponentially with working with athletes, because you know, they are the general public. They've just got a different tag on them. They are the same people, different job, you know, and maybe a little bit of different genetics, but everyone's got that same desire, you know. Although I have to say, someone who wants to learn to walk again, or someone who is losing something they've already had, like someone with a degenerative disease, and they will work so hard to maintain the ability to look after themselves and live by themselves and walk and stay out of a wheelchair, harder than any athlete I've ever worked with. And I've worked with
you
some
know,
pretty darn good athletes, but oh my gosh, you realize how hard some people will work when they're in that position.
I
you
find
look at
it interesting
Ed,
that you said about athletes have a label, obviously, and they have that expectation. And I think that a lot of people have those labels attached because they have something to identify with. But as you said, that you can learn so much from general populations. But I feel like most people should take athletes or coaches or teams off pedestals because they are just human beings. Treat them like a human being. And if you get that and you understand that individual and then how you can impact that with the breadth of knowledge and experience that you've created, well, that's all you're doing. You're just going from A to B, and then, you know, plan A may not work. You go to another plan and treat them like human beings rather than putting them onto that pedestal of, oh, you're Formula One championship, or you're this, or you're that.
Well, that's when you become a fan as well, when you think of them like that. And you're not really building a relationship. You're just like hero worshipping them, which doesn't do them any favors.
No, and that's why, you know, I don't know if you know a guy called Ed Jackson. Maybe Tulsa's heard of him, but he was a rugby player that I worked with at London Welsh, and then he went on to Wasps, and he jumped into a swimming pool and broke his neck. And now he's created a charity called Millimeters to Mountains, and you know, he's gone from being able to move a millimeter, you know, with his big toe, and now he's just climbed Gran Paradiso in the French Alps, or the Italian Alps, sorry. And you're like, talk about purpose. You know, he was heavily driven as a rugby player to be and that was his, and he has a hugely adapted, of course, to what he's doing now, and the amazing, fantastic work. You know, they walk the spine of England, which is, unbelievable. And that's where that purpose, if somebody has it, it's nothing, it's not a grind, and that's what comes back to that. It's not, training, in a professional environment. A lot of players didn't see it as a grind because they realized that was an opportunity to get better, and that was the thing that was going to allow them to perform at the weekend or race day or whatever it was going to be. And you have to take your time to really sit down and, and some, you can help people, you can have these deep conversations about purpose and, talk them through and ask them questions, but eventually you need that time, that space to do your own thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I agree. Great answers so far.
I know.
We normally do some quick fires, so we're going to move on to our quick fire round. Some people have taken a little bit longer to answer these, so there's no pressure on time limit or anything like that. But speaking of internships and a lot of lessons that young coaches can learn, what would you say are areas that you feel coaches should work on if they want to enter the field of motorsport in particular? I've had a lot of people like direct message me and I'm like, I don't have all the answers. Just as you said previously, like anything isn't linear. There isn't a progressive thing of tick box this, get all this. Like you get all the education and the knowledge in terms of the letters behind your name, but then what? And I feel like it's a really difficult thing for me to answer. So I'm just going to pass the buck to you.
Right, two points. I'm going to try and make them as quick as possible. Firstly, it goes back to purpose. Why do you specifically want to work in motorsports? What is drawing you to that, basically? Is it just the sport? And you want to be part of, that whole circus. Not that it's like, an entertainment, well, it is an entertainment, but, that kind of thing.
I would describe it as a circus, yeah.
But for me, come back to that vision and say that's what you want to do, and don't worry about how you're going to get there, and just keep working at that, from a I've just started reading The Buddha and the Badass, and I'm on
You
that
have
first.
it on my list. Oh,
So
What
it's
is
the
it?
first guy. It's called The Buddha and the Badass. It's by the guy
Okay.
he's done the Mind Valley stuff. I can't pronounce his second name. You
Nishan
might know that.
Lakiani.
There you go.
Yeah.
And people worry too much about the how and not the what. So if there is any young aspiring performance coaches, which is different, which is interesting, because I know it's a quick fire, but if you think about it, I know lots of people that want to be a strength and conditioning in rugby because they've played rugby,
Yeah.
to a goodish level, and then they're like, right, I'm not going to make it. So, for me to be in part of that environment, I'll go off and become a strength and conditioning coach for rugby specifically. Whereas in motorsports, I don't think you'll see Lewis Hamilton when he retires, change tact and go into becoming a trainer for rugby, for motorsports. Sorry.
Yeah.
And I don't see some of the young drivers coming through developing like that. It'll just be people that are really interested in the sport and love the sport.
Yeah, that's a good answer. But then, okay, so last quick fire from me. I know, and you mentioned earlier about safety in motorsport in terms of one of the slim reasons why there is a lack of research produced in the field of motorsport is because of the safety of the drivers and obviously the technology that you can attach to the drivers. So that's why there's a lot of restriction. But why do you think that in itself produces less research material, and what can be changed about it?
I think that, like, let's put a different example. I could go and reasonably talk to any strength and conditioning coach in rugby and say, what are you doing? How are you doing it? Why are you doing it? And they're very open to say, hey, yeah, this is what, because there's probably that inner belief that it doesn't really matter what I tell him, I can deliver it much, much better. So there's a whole area of, collaboration, so rugby league, Dan Baker, this is exactly what I do. This is exactly what I did to get success. And all the coaches are like, wow, pretty good. But the problem is in motorsports is you can't really do that because the margins are so fine in some respects that everybody is trying to be so secretive about what they're doing. And I think that's just the nature of the sport, that, the teams are very secretive. People are trying to hide the latest designs for this component, and we're going to use these different, all this types of stuff. And obviously, yeah, as a coach, you do have some jobbish, you want to keep your job. So if I go around, or I'm doing this, I'm doing that, I'm doing this, and somebody finds out that the driver you're working with is like, why are you going around telling everybody our secrets? Well, there are no secrets.
Yeah.
And that's the sport. And whether it's because rugby strength and conditioning, football, I know that 3 or 4 of my friends in sports, I could ring up and say, hey, what are you doing at this football club at the moment with your under 20s? What does it look like? Blah, 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 blah. How many kilometers are they doing each week? Why are you doing this? Why are you doing that? And I'm pretty sure they'd turn around and in confidence give me the answers. But maybe in motorsports, it's not widely accepted.
Are there any non-disclosure agreements as a coach in? No, there are.
Yeah. Well,
there is.
in what case?
As a strength and conditioning coach in motorsports, because I'm sure there is, as perhaps the engineer, the driver, the designer, if there's a designer, but those other roles.
Tulsa would probably know more than me about
there
that.
Definitely is when you sign with a certain company, and then within the company you've got NDAs in terms of what you can speak about, so you do have to be quite careful. And I feel like what Leah's spoken about, that does really translate into training, Because when the teams give you NDAs that you do have to sign regarding what you can speak about in public, unless you're obviously an expert. And working with such a big team, it just means that it's that much more important. And you do want to adhere to it because it's obviously your job. But when it comes to training, it's almost like it's an unwritten rule, because you already know that there's these rules and regulations with the NDAs and social media and talking to public and things like that. So it's almost like you're already told, well, make it secretive. And it's almost like it's inherent in the culture. Like, people always are like, yeah, we're against this team, we're against everyone, we're in it for ourselves. And it's like, it is definitely a culture thing in Formula One.
Yeah. And I think that if I think back to some of the coaches that I know have worked with good drivers, I look back and I think about where that coach came from. Did they come from a team sport, or did they come from an individual sport? And how you interact, because as a coach, you want to talk about the thing that you love doing to the person that probably loves it as much as you, because that's it's
a joy.
That's a huge, that's what gives you energy,
Plus, you can learn more. If you're talking to somebody, they can give you more information anyway.
And you might have these discussions about whatever you wanted, and if you have them with somebody who's your friend, they'll be like, yeah, this is great, isn't it? And then if you talk to a coach, they're like, no, but I've done it like this. Oh, wow, that's a great idea. And you're like, wow, okay. Dave Tate, live, learn, and pass it on. And basically, if you think about it now, I think that's a great progression for people to think about as coaches. Live it, learn about it, make sure you know how to do it, and then pass it on. But from some coaches, especially on social media, they're already on the pass it on point, where they haven't really learned it and they haven't really lived it. A prime example is a guy on social media I know. He's a young lad, and fair play to him. He's pumping out, whatever. But he's 23, 24. How much real life experience does that individual have? And that's not, that's the game we're in at the moment. But it's like, hey, just take a step back, just be patient, just go off and just, be on the the work, to be on the factory floor for a bit longer, basically. And I'm not saying that, like compared to a Dave Tate, for example, who have done thousands and thousands of hours of coaching and et cetera, but just being less of a rush, just enjoy the, I know it's like a crappy saying, enjoy the process, because a lot of people are like, yeah, but that's not going to pay the bills. But I'm like, just keep enjoying it. And that's the biggest thing I've learned now, and it's the number one thing I'd say to every young coach. And sometimes I'd say Darren Roberts say it, it's adult PE, just have some freaking fun.
I haven't heard that, but that's cool.
And that's the problem, because I think we're in an industry where we are so worried about losing our job. You are so worried about making mistakes that what happens is you don't make the small mistakes to learn from. You go off and make a great big freaking mistake that will put you in a world of crap. And that's really why I really enjoyed end stage rehab, because the physio, I've gone to physio, can I do this, this and this? And they're like, yeah, crack on. And then you're in the gym one-on-one, you can just play around with things. You can experiment. And trust me, if somebody's coming back from a big long injury, you'd spend more time with that individual than you might spend with your family member, and you've got to realize that. So I don't think that I've ever seen in a master's course or in a degree a module about having fun.
No, I don't think so either. No, but it's a good plan.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, as long as I'm on the same page as Tols, one of our favourite things to do is to take advantage of the 7 degrees of separation and get you to suggest to us someone that you know that we won't necessarily know, but you know that you can put us in contact with who would be a great guest on the podcast. And it doesn't have to be a coach. Is
That's
that the
a
right
profile
question?
pic right there. Look at that. Look at that thinking face.
Oh, yes,
Oh,
yes.
my
It
thinking face,
was
yeah.
a real, yeah.
Oh, wow.
Well, there's no pressure. I was doing a podcast question. I was asking this question, and so we came up with 3 answers, and I'm like, all right, fire them over to us. It's fine. Just give us the contact details.
Yeah.
But,
Yeah, give us as many as you like.
if you have more than one, we'd be happy to take them on board if they obviously are willing. But yeah.
Oh wow, that's a good, and the problem is that I've seen you sent me that question, didn't you?
Yeah, but you know what? The fact is this is the longest time that you've taken to answer. I mean, you're really thinking about it. You're stumbled.
So I think
the thinking
yeah,
face.
the thinking face.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I want to make sure that. So I would suggest. Let me think. Who you don't know. That's the thing I'm thinking. Like, who do you know? So I would.
Someone said,
think,
yeah, go.
If you don't, Tulsa might know him, but Rich Hussaini's got quite an interesting story. So, and how he's like, I know Rich well, and I met him at one of my internships probably 10 years ago. And that's a very kind of interesting thing. I could put you into touch, but Karima Holcomb is a very interesting person to speak to. So she was a Red Bull athlete, jumping off cliffs, free driving, whatever, and she jumped out of an airplane and a parachute didn't open, or partially opened, and obviously she's alive. But she's got a very interesting story.
Oh yeah, we need to speak to
and
her.
Also, if you could, I would definitely speak to Ed Jackson, what I touched on. He is, he's very, very busy at the moment. He's climbing mountains and stuff, but his story is unbelievable.
It would definitely be interesting to hear from an athlete's perspective about mental well-being, overcoming injuries, and becoming mentally resilient. And I feel like that's something that we've not really touched on this podcast. So that's definitely something that we can talk about.
What I find really interesting is that obviously with lockdown, I've interviewed some of my ex-players that I've worked with and people, and a few of them have been really open on a podcast about their mental struggles. One player in particular was talking about this huge fear of failure that drove him to push himself as hard as he did every day. And it's not a great, that to drive you motivationally wise is not a great place to come from, that fear of failure. Johnny Wilkinson was a huge individual that was driven by fear of failure. And he had some tough times with injury, and how that, what was it? I think when he was 7, he's like, I want to win the World Cup, and then he won the World Cup, and he's like, what am I going to do with my life now, basically? And it's like, how does the likes of those individuals keep moving forward? And that's the hugest thing. You look at, for example, Liverpool, they've won the league now. It's great to win a league, but to win back-to-back leagues shows that you are a team of not only, form is temporary, class is permanent, and it's to show that you're that individual or that team collectively. And as a coach, it's exactly the same. Everyone can have good days of coaching, everyone can have bad days of coaching, but consistently being able to coach well all the time is your money winner, basically.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. So you can put us into contact with some of those people? Not Johnny
Yeah.
Wilkinson, perhaps. Well, probably you could. But yeah, no. Well, send them over. Do you remember them, Tols? I actually
Yeah,
don't.
I do.
You do? Okay, good.
So we're going to get
Yeah,
Rick,
yeah.
Screamer, and Ed on, definitely. That'll be amazing. Maybe one of them we can get you on back again, and you can grill them too.
Yeah. I'm just
That would be
thinking now.
All
Yeah.
3 ways. I love it.
Yeah.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for
You're
taking
welcome.
the time out to answer all of our questions. And they were great answers, right, Cal?
Yeah, really interesting to me.
Yeah, same.
Hopefully to your listeners.
Yeah.
as well.
Always. They
For
do seem
everyone
to.
who has
Yeah.
heard, has been listening, sorry. Lee, how do people get in touch with you via social media if people were to contact you directly or follow you on Instagram or Twitter? What are your handles?
So at the Athlete Tribe is Instagram. I'm not really big on Twitter. And just my email address is info@theathletetribe.com. And they're the 2 easiest ways that I'll respond.
All right.
Brilliant.
No worries.
Well, thank
All
you
right.
so much. And we'll speak
We'll
to
have
you
to do a
soon.
photo.
Love
Yeah,
it.
that works.
Amazing. Well, thanks.
All right.
No worries. You're welcome.
Thank you so much. Lovely to meet you.
Yeah, you too. Yeah.